I'd wake up every morning to the smell of fresh coffee drifting through our tiny kitchen, believing I was the luckiest woman alive. My husband, Ethan, would kiss my forehead before leaving for work, whispering that he'd see me tonight, and I'd smile like every fairy tale I wife. Every tame had somehow found its way into my ordinary life. Looking back now, I realize that happiness has a dangerous way of blinding you. It makes you ignore the little things, the strange glances, the awkward silences, the feeling that someone in the room smiles with their lips but not with their eyes. If I had paid attention sooner, maybe everything that happened afterward could have been stopped. Maybe I wouldn't have spent 2 years fighting to save my marriage from a woman who never wanted to weigh me in the family to begin with. My name is Claire, and the villain in my story wasn't an ex-girlfriend, a jealous coworker, or some mysterious stranger. It was my own mother-in-law. Before you judge me for what I eventually did to her, hear me out until the end, because I promise you, revenge wasn't the first thing on my mind. It was the last thing. But sometimes people push you so far that they create the monster they later complain about. When Ethan proposed to me, his mother, Linda, hugged me tightly and smiled so warmly that everyone around us commented on how lucky I was to have such a loving future mother-in-law. She even cried during our engagement dinner. She toasted to our future, called me the daughter she never had, and insisted on helping plan every detail of our wedding. I believed every word. Why wouldn't I? She baked me cookies when I visited. She complimented my dresses. She told her friends how beautiful I was. She acted like my biggest supporter. I had no idea that every compliment came with a hidden knife attached. The first crack appeared 3 weeks after our wedding. Ethan and I had just returned from our honeymoon when Linda stopped by unannounced with homemade lasagna. She walked around our apartment inspecting everything. She opened cabinets without asking, peeked into our bedroom, rearranged my spice rack, and laughed as though she owned the place. Then she looked inside the refrigerator and frowned. "You really don't cook much, do you?" she asked casually. I laughed awkwardly and said we'd been away for 2 weeks. She nodded but added, "Ethan grew up eating fresh meals every day. Frozen food isn't exactly wife material." Ethan chuckled nervously and changed the subject. I told myself she didn't mean anything by it. Older generations could be blunt. At least, that's what everyone kept telling me. Then the comments became weekly. If I wore makeup, she asked why I felt the need to impress strangers. If I wore none, she suggested I looked tired. If I cooked dinner, she'd quietly point out how Ethan preferred his potatoes seasoned differently. If we ordered takeout, she'd sigh dramatically and remind us that money didn't grow on trees. Every visit left me feeling smaller than before, but I kept smiling because I loved Ethan and he adored his mother. I didn't want to be the wife who caused problems between them. I thought patience would eventually win her over. Instead, my silence convinced her that I was an easy target. A few months later, Ethan started acting strangely. Not dramatically different, just distracted. He'd ask random questions that felt oddly specific. "Did you really spend $300 at the mall last week?" he asked one evening while we watched television. I blinked in confusion because I hadn't gone shopping in over a month. I showed him my bank account. There was no such purchase. He apologized, saying he must have misunderstood something. Then a week later he asked why I'd ignored his lunch messages. Except I hadn't. I pulled out my phone. Every text I'd sent was there. He looked confused because he swore he'd never received them. Strange little misunderstandings kept piling up like tiny stones until they became impossible to ignore. Then came the first real bombshell. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan walked into our living room holding his phone with a look I'd never seen before. Disappointment, hurt, doubt. He asked me one question that made my stomach drop. "Have you been talking to your ex?" I almost laughed because it sounded ridiculous. My ex and I hadn't spoken in nearly 4 years. Ethan silently handed me his phone. There, on the screen, was a screenshot of what looked like a conversation between me and my former boyfriend. The messages were flirtatious, intimate. They talked about meeting secretly while Ethan was at work. My heart nearly stopped. "This isn't real," I whispered. Ethan stared at me. "Mom said someone anonymously sent it to her because they thought I deserved to know." My blood turned cold. Linda had received it before Ethan did. Convenient. I immediately opened my messaging apps. Nothing. No conversation existed. The screenshots were fake. Poorly edited once I looked closely, but convincing enough to plant doubt. Ethan believed me after we examined them together, but I couldn't shake one question. Why had the anonymous sender chosen Linda? Out of every person in the world. I asked her directly the next day. She looked horrified that I'd even suggest such a thing. She clutched her chest dramatically and said, "Claire, I'm trying to protect my son. If someone sent me information like that, how could I keep it from him?" Then she started crying. Actual tears. Ethan immediately comforted her, while I stood there, feeling like I'd somehow become the villain for asking a perfectly reasonable question. That was the moment I realized something dangerous. Linda didn't just know how to manipulate people. She knew exactly when to cry, when to act offended, and when to play the victim. She controlled every conversation without raising her voice. Weeks passed, and things settled down, or at least they appeared to. Ethan trusted me again, but I noticed Linda watching us differently. She studied us like a chess player, waiting for the perfect opportunity to move another piece. Then Christmas arrived. We spent the holiday at her house with Ethan's brother, his wife, several cousins, and family friends. Everything seemed normal until dessert. Linda stood to make a toast. She spoke about family, loyalty, honesty, and how difficult it was to watch people change after marriage. Then she looked directly at me before saying, "Some women marry for love. Others marry because they're looking for stability. A mother always knows the difference." The room went silent. Nobody said a word. Everyone avoided eye contact. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table, but he didn't challenge her. He simply whispered, "Ignore it. Ignore it." Those two words echoed in my mind the entire drive home. Ignore the insults. Ignore the accusations. Ignore the manipulation. Ignore the humiliation. That's what I'd been doing since the wedding. And where had it gotten me? I stared out the car window as snowflakes drifted through the darkness, wondering if love alone was enough to survive a marriage where someone else was constantly trying to poison it. What I didn't know was that Linda wasn't finished. In fact, everything she'd done so far had only been the warm-up. The real attack, the one that would nearly destroy my marriage forever, was already in motion, and by the time I discovered it, trusting anyone would become almost impossible. The first time I realized someone was deliberately trying to erase me from my own marriage, I didn't scream. I didn't confront anyone. I simply sat on the edge of our bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, staring at the ceiling while Ethan slept beside me, wondering how a woman could smile in your face while quietly digging the ground beneath your feet. I kept replaying Christmas dinner in my head, especially Linda's words. "A mother always knows the difference." At the time, everyone had laughed awkwardly and moved on, but the sentence refused to leave me. It wasn't a joke. It was a warning. She wanted me to know that no matter what happened, she believed she had the final say over her son's life. And maybe the most painful part wasn't what she said. It was the fact that no one stopped her. Not Ethan, not his brother, not anyone sitting around that table. They had become so used to Linda controlling every room she entered that challenging her simply wasn't worth the trouble. I wish I had understood then that silence always benefits the bully. After New Year's, things became strangely peaceful. Too peaceful. Linda stopped making rude comments. She stopped dropping by unexpectedly. She even texted me one afternoon, saying she hoped we could start fresh. I actually smiled when I read it. I remember thinking maybe she'd realized she'd been too hard on me. Maybe all those books that said relationships take time were right. I told Ethan I wanted to invite her over for dinner. He looked relieved, almost emotional. "Thank you," he said. "This means a lot to me." I wanted peace for his sake as much as mine. That dinner turned out to be one of the biggest mistakes I ever made. Linda arrived carrying flowers, a bottle of wine, and a warm smile that almost made me forget everything. She complimented the apartment, praised the meal I'd cooked, and even hugged me before leaving. As soon as she walked out the door, Ethan wrapped his arms around me. "See?" he whispered. "I knew things would get better." I wanted to believe him. 3 days later, my office manager called me into her office. The expression on her face immediately made my stomach tighten. She closed the door and gently slid an envelope across the desk. "Claire," she said carefully, "I need you to explain this." Inside the envelope were printed screenshots. Dozens of them, Anonymous emails had been sent to the company's human resources department, accusing me of having an affair with one of the senior managers. There were edited photographs showing me standing unusually close to him at office events. There were fake conversations, fake hotel reservations, even fabricated receipts. Someone had gone through an unbelievable amount of effort. I couldn't even speak. My manager stared at me sympathetically. "I don't believe this," she admitted, "but HR has to investigate." For 2 weeks, I lived through absolute humiliation. Coworkers whispered whenever I entered the break room. People stopped including me in meetings. One woman I considered a close friend suddenly became distant. Even though the investigation eventually cleared me completely, the damage had already been done. People never completely forget accusations, even false ones. When I got home, after receiving the official report proving my innocence, I cried harder than I had in years. Ethan held me tightly. "I know you didn't do any of this. I just don't understand who hates me this much." Neither of us said Linda's name, but both of us thought it, or at least I hoped he did. A week later, something happened that made my suspicions impossible to ignore. I was folding laundry when Ethan's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Normally I never touched his phone. Privacy mattered to both of us. But he was in the shower, and the screen lit up with a message preview from his mother. It read, "Did she believe the office thing was anonymous?" I froze. Before I could even process those words, another message appeared. "Delete these messages after you read them." My hands started shaking. I wasn't trying to spy. I wasn't looking for evidence. The evidence had practically jumped into my lap. I stood there for several seconds before locking the screen again. When Ethan came out of the bathroom, I asked him one simple question. "What exactly does your mother mean by the office thing?" His smile disappeared instantly. "What?" I repeated the message word for word. He stared at me before slowly unlocking his phone. His face turned pale. The conversation had already been deleted. Only those notification previews had remained. I don't know. For the first time since we'd been married, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of me. Fear of what his mother might actually be capable of. That evening he drove straight to Linda's house. He didn't tell me he was going. He simply grabbed his keys and left. For almost 3 hours I sat alone, imagining every possible outcome. Maybe she'd confess. Maybe she'd apologize. Maybe she'd finally admit she hated me. Instead, Ethan returned looking exhausted. "What happened?" I asked. He sat quietly for nearly a minute. Then he finally answered. "She cried." "Of course she did." He explained that Linda claimed someone had hacked her phone. She insisted the deleted messages were taken out of context. She swore she'd only been asking whether I'd been emotionally affected by the office investigation. She even accused me of trying to turn Ethan against his own mother. I laughed, not because anything was funny, because I couldn't believe how predictable she'd become. Every single time she was cornered, she followed the exact same script. Deny, cry, become the victim, shift the blame. It worked because everyone wanted to believe her. Everyone except me. A few nights later I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I walked into the living room and noticed Ethan sitting alone in the dark. He looked completely defeated. "I don't know what to do anymore," he admitted. "I love you. I love Mom. And somehow every month I'm forced to choose." I sat beside him. "You don't have to choose." He looked at me hopefully. "You just have to choose the truth." Those words stayed with both of us. For the first time, we stopped asking whether Linda could be behind everything. Instead, we started asking how to prove it. But proving manipulation is incredibly difficult. Manipulators rarely leave fingerprints. They convince other people to do their dirty work. They use anonymous accounts, fake phone numbers, friends who owe them favors. Everything always traces back to someone else. Weeks passed without answers. Then one afternoon, completely by accident, I met someone who would change everything. Her name was Diane. She had been Linda's closest friend for over 20 years. I bumped into her while grocery shopping. She smiled warmly before suddenly asking, "So, did you and Linda ever work things out?" I forced a polite smile. "We're trying." Diane hesitated. "You know, she talks about you a lot." My heartbeat quickened. "What does she say?" Diane immediately looked uncomfortable. "I probably shouldn't." "It's okay." "No," she sighed, "it's really not." She apologized and walked away, but before reaching the parking lot, she turned around. There was guilt written all over her face. She hurried back toward me. I shouldn't even be telling you this. What? Just be careful. Those 3 words hit harder than anything else. She leaned closer. Linda isn't trying to fix your marriage. She's waiting for it to end. I felt every ounce of blood drain from my face. Then Diane whispered something that completely changed the direction of my life. Claire, you're not the first wife she's done this to. The grocery bag slipped from my hands and crashed onto the floor. I stared at her, unable to breathe. What do you mean? She looked around to make sure no one else could hear. Then she quietly said, Ethan was engaged once before you. I know, I answered. They broke up. Diane slowly shook her head. No, they didn't just break up. Linda made sure they did. And in that moment, I realized my nightmare hadn't started with me. It had started years earlier. I wasn't her first target. I was simply the latest. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Diane's words kept echoing in my mind, like a song I desperately wanted to stop hearing. You're not the first wife she's done this to. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Linda standing at our wedding, smiling through happy tears while secretly planning the day she'd tear everything apart. I had spent nearly 2 years believing I was simply failing to win over a difficult mother-in-law. But what if that had never been the goal? What if no woman would ever be good enough because Linda didn't win at her? If USD's eighte, the thought terrified me more than anything she'd done so far. I waited until Ethan woke up the next morning before telling him everything Diane had said. I expected him to dismiss it immediately, but instead he sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring into his untouched coffee. His silence scared me. Say something, I whispered. He rubbed both hands across his face before finally speaking. There was someone before you. I nodded. You told me about her. You said the relationship just didn't work out. Ethan looked ashamed. That's what Mom always said. I frowned. Always? He swallowed hard. The truth is, I never really understood why Emily left. The name hit me like a brick. Emily. Until that morning, she'd been nothing more than a passing reference from years ago. Someone Ethan had dated before we met. Now she suddenly felt like the missing chapter in a story I hadn't known I was reading. Ethan explained that they had been together for almost 4 years. They were engaged, had already booked a wedding venue, and were even shopping for their first house together. According to Linda, Emily had become cold in the months before the wedding. She supposedly started lying, hiding things, and acting distant until one day she ended the engagement without much explanation. Ethan had believed his mother because he had no reason not to. Emily refused to defend herself. She simply disappeared from his life. I spent years thinking she fell out of love with me, he admitted quietly. Now, I don't know what to believe. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Then let's find out. Finding Emily turned out to be easier than either of us expected. She had moved to another city, but social media made people easier to locate than ever before. Ethan stared at her profile picture for nearly 5 minutes before sending a message. We didn't know if she'd respond. Honestly, I wasn't sure she should. If my ex-fiancé suddenly contacted me after years of silence, I'd probably ignore him too. 2 days passed with nothing. Then, late Friday evening, Ethan's phone buzzed. Emily had replied. Her message was short. If you're finally ready to know the truth, I'll talk. My heart started pounding. She agreed to meet us the following weekend at a quiet cafe halfway between our cities. The entire drive there was painfully silent. Ethan gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I could tell he was terrified, not because he still loved Emily, but because he feared discovering that his own mother had stolen years of his life through lies. When we arrived, Emily was already waiting at a corner table. She looked older, of course, but peaceful in a way that surprised me. She smiled politely when she saw us, though there was sadness behind her eyes. Ethan sat across from her, struggling to find the right words. Finally, he whispered, I'm sorry. Emily blinked. For what? For never asking your side. She looked down at her coffee and gave a small, bittersweet laugh. I wondered how long it would take. For almost 2 hours, Emily told us everything. At first, Linda had adored her, just as she'd adored me. She baked desserts, offered wedding advice, and constantly reminded Emily that she was already family. Then, little by little, things changed. Linda began criticizing everything, from the way Emily dressed to how she decorated their future home. She questioned every financial decision. She constantly compared Emily to Ethan's ex-girlfriends, insisting they had all been more traditional. When subtle criticism didn't work, the manipulation escalated. Emily began receiving anonymous messages claiming Ethan was secretly seeing another woman. Fake photographs appeared. Friends suddenly stopped talking to her because of rumors she'd never heard before. One afternoon, she even received an envelope containing printed screenshots of fake conversations between Ethan and a coworker. "I almost believed them," Emily admitted. Ethan looked devastated. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I did." The cafe suddenly felt very quiet. Ethan stared at her in confusion. "No, you never showed me anything." Emily slowly reached into her purse and removed an old notebook. Between its pages was a faded copy of a handwritten letter. "I gave this to your mother," she said softly. "She promised she'd hand it to you because you weren't answering my calls." Ethan unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The letter begged him to meet before believing the rumors. It explained that someone was trying to destroy their relationship. It ended with one heartbreaking sentence: "Please don't let someone else make this decision for us." Ethan looked up with tears streaming down his face. "I never got this." Emily nodded sadly. "I know." Then she delivered the sentence that shattered what little faith remained. "Your mother visited me the day after I mailed that letter." Ethan's breathing became uneven. "What did she say?" Emily stared directly at him. "She told me you had already moved on. She said you'd admitted marrying me would be the biggest mistake of your life. She told me you were embarrassed by the engagement and only stayed because you felt guilty." Ethan buried his face in his hands. "I never said any of that." "I know," Emily whispered. "I realized that years later." She explained that months after their breakup, one of Linda's old friends quietly contacted her and admitted that Linda had been spreading lies to both sides. Emily tried reaching Ethan again, but by then he had blocked her number, believing she wanted to reopen old wounds. Eventually, she accepted that the truth would probably never matter. She rebuilt her life, married someone else, and promised herself she'd never let Linda control another chapter of her story. She looked at me with genuine sympathy. When I heard Ethan had gotten married again, I prayed she'd changed. She paused before adding, "Clearly, she hasn't." On the drive home, Ethan didn't speak for nearly an hour. Then he pulled into an empty roadside parking area and turned off the engine. His shoulders started shaking. I'd never seen him cry before, not when he lost his grandfather, not during stressful times at work, never. But now he broke down completely. "I ruined her life," he whispered. "No," I answered gently. "Your mother did." He shook his head. "I believed her. I chose her version of the story because it was easier." I held his hand while he cried, knowing this wasn't just grief. It was guilt. The painful realization that someone he trusted more than anyone had manipulated him for years. That evening, something inside Ethan changed. For the first time since I'd known him, he stopped defending Linda. He stopped making excuses about her generation, her personality, or her intentions. Instead, he opened an old storage box in the garage, filled with family papers, photographs, and forgotten documents. "If she's been lying for this long," he said, "then there has to be more." We spent hours sorting through dusty folders. Most of it was ordinary family memorabilia, until I noticed a thick envelope tucked beneath a stack of photo albums. It had no name written on it, just the word "private" in black marker. Ethan frowned. "I've never seen this before." He opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of printed emails, photographs, handwritten notes, and newspaper clippings. At first they seemed unrelated. Then we started noticing something chilling. Every document involved someone who had once been close to Ethan. Old girlfriends, childhood friends, even one college roommate. Beside several names were handwritten comments in Linda's unmistakable handwriting. "Bad influence. Too controlling. Not loyal enough. Must keep distance." It wasn't just a collection of memories. It was a file on people she wanted out of Ethan's life. As we turned another page, a small business card slipped onto the floor. I picked it up absent-mindedly before realizing what it was. It belonged to a private investigator. Neither of us said a word. We simply stared at each other. Because if Linda had hired a private investigator, then everything we thought we knew about her obsession was only scratching the surface. I held the business card so tightly, that the edges dug into my fingers. The room suddenly felt colder. Neither Ethan nor I spoke for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't just the fact that Linda had a private investigator's business card hidden away. It was where we'd found it, inside a carefully organized file filled with information about people who had once mattered to Ethan. Every page painted the same disturbing picture. She wasn't simply an overprotective mother. She had been quietly monitoring, judging, and, in some cases, eliminating anyone she believed threatened her place in her son's life. The realization made my skin crawl. Ethan slowly picked up the card from my hand and turned it over. On the back was a handwritten note in Linda's neat cursive, *, very reliable. Doesn't ask questions. I felt sick. How long has she been doing this? I whispered. Ethan shook his head, unable to answer. We continued digging through the envelope, our hands trembling with every document we uncovered. There were printed property records, social media screenshots, copies of public court filings involving people Ethan had once known, and even notes about my parents. My parents? I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was a page listing my father's former employer, another mentioning my mother's volunteer work. There was even a note describing the neighborhood where I grew up. None of it was illegal information. Most of it could probably be found online. But why would anyone spend hours collecting it, unless they were searching for something, or hoping to create something? I suddenly remembered the fake office affair, the edited text messages, the anonymous emails. Whoever had done those things knew exactly how to gather information before twisting it into a believable lie. That wasn't random. That was preparation. For the next several days, Ethan and I stopped talking about confronting Linda. Instead, we started quietly collecting evidence. Not because we wanted revenge, because we knew that if we confronted her without proof, she'd simply cry again. She'd deny everything. And somehow, we'd become the villains all over again. So we documented every strange event we could remember, every fake screenshot, every anonymous message, every suspicious coincidence. We created timelines, compared dates, saved phone records, printed emails. By the end of the week, our dining room looked less like a home and more like a detective's office. Strings weren't connecting photographs on the wall like in movies, but our notebooks certainly were. Patterns started appearing. Almost every major incident happened shortly after Linda had visited us, or shortly after we'd shared good news with her. When Ethan received a promotion, the fake affair accusations appeared. When we announced we were thinking about buying a house, anonymous financial rumors reached his relatives. When we discussed trying for a baby, I suddenly froze. Ethan. He looked up. The doctor. His expression changed instantly. Months earlier, we'd quietly visited a fertility specialist after struggling to conceive. Only 3 people knew. Me, Ethan, Linda. A week after that appointment, one of Ethan's aunts had casually asked me during a family barbecue if my medical problems were getting any better. I had been stunned. We had told absolutely no one. At the time, I assumed Ethan had accidentally mentioned something. Now I knew better. Linda had been spreading our most private struggles around the family, like neighborhood gossip. I felt physically ill. That night, I cried harder than I had in months. Not because of the rumors, because infertility had already been painful enough. Knowing she'd used it as entertainment made the wound even deeper. Ethan cried with me. I should have protected you. You didn't know. I should have. The guilt in his voice was almost unbearable. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Linda noticed us pulling away. She began calling Ethan constantly. If he didn't answer within an hour, she'd call again. Then she'd text. Then email. Then suddenly appear outside our house carrying homemade food. She wasn't checking on him. She was checking her control. One Saturday morning, our doorbell rang repeatedly. When I opened the door, Linda stood there smiling with 2 apple pies. I thought we'd have lunch together. We didn't make plans, I answered politely. Oh, family doesn't need invitations. Before I could respond, she walked straight inside, just like she always had. Except this time, Ethan stepped into the hallway. Mom, she smiled. Hi, sweetheart. You need to leave. The smile disappeared. What? You can't keep coming over unannounced. She laughed nervously. Don't be ridiculous. I'm your mother, and this is my home. The sentence hung in the air. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it carried more weight than any argument we'd ever had. Linda stared at him as though she'd never seen him before. Then, almost on cue, the tears arrived. I knew she'd turn you against me. No, Ethan answered calmly. You did that yourself. For a brief second, I saw something I'd never seen in Linda's eyes. Not sadness, not guilt, pure anger. The mask slipped. Only for a moment. But it was enough. She pointed directly at me. You think you've won. I didn't answer. You've poisoned him. Still, I remained silent. She laughed bitterly. Do you really believe he'll choose you forever? Ethan opened the front door. It's time for you to leave. She picked up the untouched pies and walked outside without another word. But before getting into her car, she looked back at us. The smile she gave wasn't warm. It wasn't motherly. It was a promise that she wasn't finished. 3 days later, our nightmare escalated again. Around 6 in the morning, someone started pounding on our front door. Not knocking, pounding. When Ethan opened it, 2 police officers were standing there. My heart nearly stopped. One officer politely explained they had received an anonymous report claiming there had been repeated domestic violence inside our home. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Someone had claimed Ethan was physically abusing me. The officers questioned us separately. They inspected the house, asked if I felt safe, asked if I'd been threatened. Thankfully, they quickly realized the report was completely false. Before leaving, one of the officers quietly apologized. It appears someone intentionally filed a malicious complaint. As soon as they drove away, Ethan leaned against the wall and whispered, "It was her." Neither of us could prove it. But we both knew, because whoever made that report knew exactly when I'd taken 2 vacation days from work, exactly when Ethan would be home, exactly how to create maximum embarrassment. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to. When I answered, a woman's voice spoke softly. "Claire? Yes? You don't know me." My heartbeat quickened. "My name is Rachel." I waited. "I used to work for the private investigator whose card you found." Every muscle in my body tensed. "I think," she hesitated. I think your mother-in-law hired us." I nearly dropped the phone, Rachel continued before I could speak. "I left that company months ago. There were things happening that didn't feel right. We weren't investigating crimes. We were gathering personal information, addresses, employment records, friends, family, schedules." She took a shaky breath. "I didn't know what it was being used for until later." I whispered, "Can you prove it?" There was a long silence. Then she answered with 7 words that changed everything. "I kept copies of every assignment. For the first time in nearly 2 years, we finally had a chance to expose Linda. And she had absolutely no idea that the walls she'd built from lies were about to come crashing down." I stared at my phone long after Rachel ended the call, hardly believing what had just happened. For nearly 2 years, Linda had controlled every story, because she counted on one thing: there would never be proof. But now, for the first time, there was. A week later, Rachel met us with a thick folder containing copies of investigation requests, payment records, emails, and detailed reports. Linda had paid to gather private information about me, Emily, and several other people who had been close to Ethan. While most of the information had been legally collected, it had later been twisted into fake screenshots, anonymous rumors, and carefully crafted lies. With our attorney's guidance, we organized every piece of evidence and quietly shared it with the people who mattered most. Close family members, the relatives Linda had manipulated for years, and even a few friends she'd used to spread gossip. We didn't post anything online. We didn't start a public campaign. We simply let the truth speak for itself. One by one, the lies Linda had built over decades began collapsing. Family members who had once believed every word she said started apologizing. Some admitted she had turned them against people they now realized were innocent. Even Ethan's brother confessed that Linda had manipulated his relationships too, but he'd been too afraid to challenge her. Then came the confrontation Linda never expected. Surrounded by the people she'd spent years deceiving, she denied everything at first. But when Rachel produced the records, when Emily revealed the hidden letter she'd never received, and when Ethan calmly listed every lie in chronological order, Linda had nowhere left to run. For the first time in her life, tears didn't save her. No one rushed to comfort her. No one defended her. they simply looked at her with disappointment. Her reputation, the perfect image she'd protected for years, fell apart in a single afternoon, not because we destroyed it, but because the truth finally caught up with her. Ethan made the painful decision to go no contact with his mother until she accepted now professional help. She refused. Months passed without a single sincere apology. Instead of chasing one, we chose peace. We moved to another city, started fresh, and slowly rebuilt the life her manipulation had nearly stolen from us. A year later, after years of heartbreak, we welcomed our beautiful baby daughter into the world. Holding her for the first time, Ethan whispered something I'll never forget. Our family begins with love, not control. Looking back, I don't feel proud that Linda lost her reputation. I feel relieved that she finally lost the power to hurt us. People often tell me I destroyed my mother-in-law's life. The truth is much simpler. She spent years destroying her own reputation, one lie at a time. I merely stopped protecting it. And if there's one lesson my story taught me, it's this. Manipulation can survive for years, but it cannot survive forever once the truth has a voice. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't ruining someone's life. It's refusing to let them ruin yours. If you've ever been made to question your own reality by someone who smiled while they lied, remember this. Keep your dignity, keep your evidence, and keep believing the truth. Eventually, the masks always fall.